The studio lights blazed down with a fierce shimmer as Stephen Colbert leaned forward in his chair, a sly smile curling at the edge of his mouth, sensing the audience's anticipation like electricity in the air. John Kennedy, the soft-spoken but sharp-witted environmental advocate, sat across from him under the glare, a man calm on the surface but holding storms beneath. The audience erupted once Stephen launched into his infamous satire segment, playful jabs flying like confetti. Each one met with laughter louder than the last. But John's eyes didn't flicker. They studied Stephen with a steady warmth that felt strangely out of place on live television. Something about his stillness made the room lean in, made the laughter feel hesitant, like it sensed a shift coming. Stephen, noticing the tension ripple, pressed it harder with a joke that hit a little too deep, landing in the tender space of John's lifelong purpose. Gasps mixed uneasily with laughter, the kind that wavers, unsure where it belongs. John inhaled once, as though collecting 1,000 thoughts at once, then exhaled with an expression that hinted he was about to steer the entire night in a direction nobody expected. The cameras tightened their focus, the room braced, and in that breath, everything changed. John leaned closer to the microphone, not defensive, not wounded, but steady and anchored like someone who had prepared for this moment all his life. He thanked Stephen for the joke he had genuinely, kindly up, and in doing so diffused the tension in a way that felt impossible a moment earlier. The audience watched, spellbound, as he spoke about the years he had dedicated to fighting for rivers near collapse, forests burning unseen, and communities struggling beneath the weight of environmental neglect. But he didn't speak like a politician or a talking head. He spoke like a human being who had watched his childhood creep turn to dust. He spoke like a son who had held his father's hand in a hospital and promised to make the world better because life was too fragile to waste. His voice carried tremors of memory, of grief, of unspoken hopes he had buried for too long. And suddenly, the studio wasn't a comedy stage anymore. It was a place where truth poured out raw and unfiltered. Stephen blinked, the smirk fading as sincerity replaced it, the air growing heavier than any punchline could cut through. John wasn't flipping the script. He was exposing a heartbeat beneath it. Stephen tried to recover, tried to regain his footing with the softer joke, but even he could hear how hollow it sounded in the new atmosphere John had built. John smiled gently, assuring him he wasn't upset, simply tired of watching important conversations slip through cracks molded by distraction. He spoke of the pressure of always being the serious guest, the one who comes in with statistics and warnings, only to be met with polite applause and forgotten urgency. He admitted he sometimes felt invisible, drowned out by noise louder than truth, overshadowed by entertainment greater than compassion. The audience leaned closer, silence unraveling across the rows of seats, the sort that comes only when people hear something that mirrors a piece of themselves. Even Stephen's posture softened, his shoulders lowering as he stopped performing and simply listened. John's voice wavered when he talked about losing hope for the first time last year, sitting alone in his apartment surrounded by manuscripts, wondering if change was even possible anymore. He confessed the fear that maybe humanity had grown numb to its own aching. But then, he said softly, light had found him in unexpected ways. He described meeting a young girl named Marisol during a volunteer cleanup, a child no older than 8 who sifted through trash with tiny gloved hands and a grin too wide for her face. She told him she didn't want the river to feel lonely anymore, that everything deserved someone who cared. John admitted that her words shattered him and rearranged him at the same time, reminding him that real change rarely begins with applause or headlines but with small hands holding big dreams. The audience felt the tremor of emotion moving through him, the vulnerability pulling down every barrier he'd ever carried into public spaces. Stephen's eyes glistened, unexpectedly tender, as though something inside him, too, had been cracked open. John said Marisol had sent him a letter last week, telling him not to give up because grown-ups needed brave people too. He said he had brought the letter with him, tucked inside his pocket like a compass he wasn't ready to lose. And the studio, once roaring with laughter, became a cathedral of silence. Every camera microphone seemed to hold its breath. Then John gently stood, surprising the crew and even himself as he pulled the letter from his pocket and opened it with trembling fingers. He read Marisol's words aloud, a simple, earnest sentences about kindness and hope and believing that people could learn to do better if someone helped them remember why it mattered. The audience listened as though the entire world depended on each syllable. When he finished, he folded the letter with reverence, as though placing a fragile treasure back into its shell. He looked at Stephen then, not accusing, not triumphant, but compassionate, offering the host something rarer than forgiveness and understanding. Stephen placed a hand over his mouth, his posture slumping with the weight of realization that jokes sometimes build walls where bridges are needed. John thanked him for giving him more time than scheduled, even if unintentionally, and the crew exchanged uncertain glances, unsure whether to cut to commercial or let this moment breathe. They let it breathe. What came next shook the studio more than anything ever scripted. John turned to the audience and, not with anger but with profound sincerity, announced that this would be his last televised interview for a long time. He said he had spent too many years trying to fit urgent truths into short segments designed for entertainment. He said he wanted to connect with people directly, without cameras, without edits, without applause cues nudging emotions one way or another. Gasps rippled, genuine and sharp. Stephen stood abruptly, the normally unshakable host appearing stunned, lost for words he couldn't reach. John apologized softly, explaining that the world didn't need more sound bites, it needed more conversations, more listening, more moments where people allowed themselves to be human. The audience watched him like someone watching a door close and open at the same time. Because his departure didn't feel like an ending, it felt like a beginning. Stephen tried to speak, his voice cracking as he called John one of the bravest guests to ever sit in that chair, and the words carried no trace of irony. He thanked John for reminding him and everyone why voices like his mattered, not despite the noise but because of it. For the first time all night, Stephen looked less like an entertainer and more like a man confronting the weight of his own platform. John stepped toward him and offered a handshake, but Stephen disregarded it and instead pulled him into an unexpected, heartfelt embrace. The audience rose to their feet, clapping not like fans of a show but like witnesses of truth. Tears glistened on more faces than the cameras could capture. Something inside the room had shifted permanently, and everyone felt it. The applause was not loud but deep. When the audience finally quieted, John walked toward the edge of the stage and turned back only once, as though anchoring the moment in memory before stepping away from the world he had outgrown. He paused as he looked into the bright lights one last time, those spotlights that had once felt like interrogations but now felt more like farewells. He said he wasn't disappearing, he was recalibrating, reorganizing his purpose so it aligned with the people who inspired him rather than the systems that exhausted him. He said he wanted to meet more children like Marisol, more communities fighting silently, more hearts trying to stay open in a world that keeps testing them. Every word resonated with the tender ache of someone choosing courage over comfort. Then he thanked everyone, not for applause but for listening. John left the set as quietly as he had arrived, but the silence he carried with him felt louder than any closing theme music. Stephen remained on stage long after the cameras went dark, staring at the empty chair across from him with a contemplative heaviness. He knew something had ended. Not just a segment but an era of how he approached his platform. The writers and producers hovered nearby, confused, waiting for instructions, but Stephen lifted a hand gently, signaling he needed a moment. He replayed John's words in his mind, the sincerity of them, the way they had peeled back layers he rarely let anyone see. He wondered when he, too, had stopped believing quiet truth could coexist with loud comedy. And later, when he finally walked off stage, he carried something new in his chest, something weighty, something hopeful. Back in his dressing room, Stephen reached for his phone and typed a message to his staff, requesting a meeting the next morning to discuss creating longer segments dedicated to real conversations. He said he wanted to offer guests more space, more time, more humanity. He wanted to reshape the show's rhythm, to make room for sincerity where satire had stood alone for too long. His reflection in the mirror looked different, as though compassion had softened the edges of the performer and revealed the man. He realized John hadn't flipped the script on him, he had handed him a new one that demanded responsibility rather than cleverness. And Stephen wasn't afraid of the challenge. He felt ready. Meanwhile, John stepped into the brisk night outside the studio, breathing in the cool air like it was the first real breath he'd taken in months. The city buzzed around him, alive and indifferent, but somehow he felt connected to it in a way he hadn't before. He walked without urgency, allowing the rhythm of traffic and footsteps to steady the storm that had lived inside him for so long. He knew the road ahead would be slower, quieter, maybe lonelier at times, but it would be honest. He smiled at the thought of meeting more people who still believed the world could be changed one small act at a time. And in that moment, for the first time in years, he felt hopeful not just for others but for himself. The inspiring message lingered as the night unfolded around him. Sometimes the most powerful moments come not when we fight to be heard, but when we choose to speak from the heart even if the room is laughing. Sometimes flipping the script doesn't mean proving someone wrong, it means revealing something true enough to transform everyone who hears it. And sometimes, the bravest thing a person can do is walk away from a spotlight that no longer aligns with their purpose, trusting that their voice will shine brighter in the spaces where it's meant to be. John Kennedy didn't end Stephen's show that night, he awakened it. He awakened everyone who watched. And as he moved toward whatever future waited for him, he carried one quiet truth: change begins when courage speaks softly, and the world finally listens.